Well, thanks so much for joining us. We're back again, and I am here with the man, the myth, the Matt, Matt Stephan, fellow Matt, fellow campus pastor. So you've just shared a wonderful message, and I want to dive a little bit deeper, if we could. You brought up comparison, and I think that is just something that we consider, we struggle with societally, and considering the implications of it. Can you share maybe a little bit more about what happens to us when we constantly compare ourselves?
Yeah, well, real simply, living in constant comparison, you miss out on your story. I can't live your story. It's almost not a helpful point of reference. And, one of the ways the Bible describes Jesus is as the author. And so Jesus is writing my story. He's writing your story. They overlap, but I'll miss what is going on over here in my story if my eyes are always on your story. Mm. And I think, everybody knows that comparison is unsatisfying, right? That's sort of conventional wisdom now. But why is it unsatisfying is because I miss out on the actual good stuff that's actually happening to me. And that's one of the scariest parts is, with comparison, we're always climbing and we're never arriving, and it never pays off. And there's something right in front of us that we're missing, our real story, and we're just hardly not participating in it. But it's happening at this subtle kind of perpetual level. We're always invited to compare. It's real natural to us. But when we live there, we miss out on our real story, what's really happening.
Yeah. That's a great perspective. I love that. So you mentioned at some point that the mess isn't the full story. We'll have some sort of mess somewhere. It reminded me of a moment last week I was sharing with our residents here at Menlo Church, and I said to them, if you start to mind the mess will mess with your mind. And the reason I said that is because we understand that there's a mental component to our self-worth and how we view ourselves. So you brought up meditation. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about that and how that affects other aspects of our life.
Yeah. Meditation on scripture, I don't know how much you've done that. There's like a lot of different techniques for it. But the first time I ever tried it, I was in seminary, and it was like an assignment, right? So I maybe wasn't doing it with the most open heart, the most pure intentions, but we were reading Celebration of Discipline by Richard Foster, kind of just a great handbook on the spiritual habits. And he has a whole chapter on meditation, and he said one technique is you read the passage of the Bible and then you imagine yourself in the story. So if it's a passage on Jesus teaching, well, you imagine yourself in the crowd, like you're smelling the crowd, you're hearing the crowd. What are you wearing? What's the angle of the sun? Like imagine all these details.
Yeah.
And, I was a little skeptical, but then Richard Foster said, this will work on any passage in the Bible. And that was like too much for me, right? So somewhat cynically, for my assignment, I decided I'm going to use a passage with no narrative, no characters, no plots. I'm going to put this to the test. So I decided to do Psalm 1, and Psalm 1's just a poem, no narrative, no characters, no plots. And it opens something like, blessed are those who have not sat in the seat of scoffers and who've not minded the counsel of the wicked, but whose delight is the law of the Lord and who meditate on the law of the Lord day and night. And just like an intersection with kind of what we were saying in the sermon, you live these stories. It's interesting because the word law there in Hebrew is Torah, right? Well, in classical thinking, the Torah isn't a list of rules. It's the first 5 books of the Bible. It's really a story. So those who meditate on the story of God, those whose delight is the story of God. And then this part of Psalm 1 finishes, they'll be like a tree planted by a stream who's always blossoming, always blooming, always bearing fruit. And so in my apartment in Los Angeles, when I'm in seminary, I'm sitting there and I'm like, okay, I'm going to imagine I'm this tree. And I'm going to meditate on the experience of being this tree. So I'm imagining the stream and what's it like being a tree. And no joke, I was overcome like a true religious experience, this profound sense of being fed through God, through my root system with God's abundant goodness.
Wow.
And, in the sermon, we're talking about meditation as a way to shape your imagination, right? And this was a moment where I had my imagination really being shaped. I'll always treasure this time of God really saying, my abundant goodness is good enough for you. It is sufficient. It will feed you. You do get to live life like this tree, always having enough, always bearing fruit. So, when we think about the mess of our life, it's kind of funny. I was studying Psalm 1 in an Old Testament survey class, and that professor, I turned in a paper late, and I was crushed. I loved this professor. I was trying so hard in seminary, and I turned in a paper late by accident, and I went in to talk to him, and he did not give me any extra credit. But he told me this, your mistakes are either going to pulverize you or galvanize you.
Ooh.
And when we come to our mess, how do we have the resources to be galvanized by the mess, not pulverized by it? And that's where the imagination comes in. I have God's abundant goodness as a resource in my life. I have this big mess in front of me, but I can go tackle it. Without the abundant goodness fed to me by the root system of my tree, which I learned in meditation, the mess is way too scary. It's going to mess with my mind. So that's kind of the way we assemble the parts of meditation, imagination, dealing with the mess. All right there in Psalm 1.
That's a great story. And honestly, Psalm 1 is one of those passages that I've probably glossed over 1,000 times.
We all have, right?
Without finding any deeper purpose within it.
Yeah, that's why I was being so obstinate in choosing Psalm 1. I was like, it's the lamest one.
So your takeaway, folks, is if you're going to do this, make sure to find a really lame passage. And don't wait until seminary. Just do it now. And you never know what's going to come out of it. So awesome.
And I was so wrong. I thought it was going to be like it didn't work, and it was amazing. I'll never forget it.
That's great. Okay, so last question. Suppose I'm on the fringes of faith. And I wanna believe in Scripture, but it's a big book, and there can be some scary and/or crazy things in there. So how do I go about discerning what is applicable to my own life? Where do you start with some of that?
Yeah, such a big question, right? Like the Bible is multifaceted. It was compiled over thousands of years, and that's part of the problem. Where do you start? How do you understand it? And like maybe the best, surest way to understand it is as a story. And, in the sermon, we talk a lot about how stories aren't just, fictions. Stories are things that we actually live. We don't have stories. We don't tell stories. We live stories. And so calling it a story, isn't a disrespect of any kind. But it helps us have a really important framework for understanding each bit. And maybe a way to understand it is, have you read Harry Potter?
Yes, in the process of actually reading to my children right now.
Okay, you're passing on the tradition of Harry Potter. So spoiler alert about Harry Potter. If you only read 6 3/4 of a book, you would get the impression Snape's a bad guy, he's a primary villain, and you won't understand him unless you know the whole story. And that's how the Bible is. You can take out these little bits, but unless you really understand the big framework of the Bible, you're really going to misunderstand like what's happening. And you could end up thinking, I thought it was about this. I thought Snape was a bad guy, but really, like he's a hero. Spoiler alert. So, it's like 20 years later.
Right. Yeah. I think you're in the safe zone now.
Okay, good.
But
I was worried.
But the story arc matters. It does.
Big time. The story arc matters. And so one simple way to think about it is like garden at the beginning, garden at the end, and this God who loves this garden, paying these costs, these very personal, almost human costs to redeem and ultimately repair and make this garden flourish again. And a lot of the passages fit pretty neatly into that. Now, there are some that are nastier, and you'll have to like really pray through it. And I think that's a good part too, right? Like we're not gleaning information from the Bible. It's really a way for us to interact with God. And so sometimes when there are passages like Genesis 34 or Romans 11:22, the kindness and severity of God, you got to pray through those. You got to ask, okay, God, like if you're real, I'm being told this is a way to experience you. Will you speak to me through this? And that's been really healing. And I think that is kind of where it intersects with our, scientific worldview. Nobody today believes anything until a scientist shows up and nods approvingly, right? But reading the Bible, I think, is mostly an empirical experience.
Yeah.
That you are going to have a hard time believing it until you read it and experience it and understand it from the inside. And that's kind of the same basic scientific worldview, right? Is we want to get inside something, we want to understand it. And if you haven't done that research, it's really not fair to weigh in on it, right?
Right.
We want to have a data-driven empirical view of things. And so I think reading the Bible for yourself is that way of getting this kind of empirical, data-driven view of it. So a real practical way to do that is to read the book of John, right? It is just so poetic and gorgeous and also simple and accessible and also incredibly deep and almost mysterious. Like, it is a great place to start gathering some of that empirical sort of research about what the Bible is. So that's where I'd start. And that's kind of how I think through those pieces.
That's great. I love what you said about a garden. I'm new to gardening, and it is painful, hard work at times.
Gardening sucks.
I don't always understand it either. I'm like, am I meant to experience this and go? What's wrong? I don't know what's wrong.
Yeah, and then I Google it, and then it's like, it either needs more water or less water.
Right, yeah.
What? Yeah.
That's wonderful. Well, thanks so much for joining us. Matt, always a pleasure to chat with you. And if you're watching this, I hope it's been meaningful for you. And we look forward to seeing you again.